He was a man forgotten by time, a lonely rancher who lived with nothing but silence, dust, and broken dreams. His heart had carried years of emptiness, and he believed life had ended for him long ago. But then came a deal so cruel it shook his soul. A young pregnant woman, betrayed by her own mother, sold like a possession. When he looked into her frightened eyes, he saw not a stranger, but a reflection of his own pain. He never wanted to own her, yet destiny forced her into his world. At first it felt like punishment, a burden too heavy. But deep inside he sensed something greater waiting to unfold. What neither of them knew was that this painful beginning was only the doorway to a miracle one that would test their strength, break their silence, and finally give them the family they both had been waiting for. In a small forgotten town, hunger ruled stronger than love. A mother, hardened by poverty, looked at her daughter not as blood but as a burden. The young girl, heavy with child, begged for mercy, but her cries were silenced by cold eyes and cruel decisions. One night, with nothing left to sell, the mother chose the unthinkable. She sold her own daughter to a lonely rancher. The deal was quick, the money was dirty, and the pain was endless. The rancher, weary of years without warmth, did not buy her for love, but for the hope of a voice in his empty house. Yet, when he saw the tears on her face, he realized he had purchased not a companion, but a broken soul. The girl, trapped between betrayal and fear, stepped into his world carrying despair, unaware that this bitter deal would one day become the beginning of a miracle. The night she arrived at the ranch, silence followed her like a shadow. The old wooden house creaked with every gust of wind, and the vast emptiness around her felt colder than the betrayal she had just suffered. She sat quietly in the corner of the room, clutching her belly, her heart pounding with fear. The rancher did not speak much. He placed a blanket near her feet, lit the fire, and left her alone. For her, it was not kindness, but another prison, only bigger than the last one. Every corner of the house reminded her that she did not belong. She avoided his eyes, refused his words, and carried her pain like a shield. The rancher, though silent, watched her from a distance. He had no desire to hurt her, yet he could not explain why he brought her home. Each morning he left early for the fields, and each evening he returned to find her sitting alone, staring out the window as if searching for an escape. She ate little, spoke less, and when the nights grew heavy with storms, she cried softly so no one could hear. Still, he heard. He heard every broken sob echoing through the thin walls. But he never entered her room. Instead, he left food at her door, fixed the leaking roof above her bed, and placed firewood by the hearth so she would never feel the cold. She never thanked him, but she noticed. Her eyes, swollen from tears, began to catch those quiet gestures. She wondered why a man who had bought her like an object would also protect her like a fragile soul. Yet her heart was too wounded to trust, and every kindness felt like a trick of fate. Days turned into weeks, and the distance between them remained. But inside that silence, a fragile thread was slowly forming. He began to read her fears without words. When she struggled to carry water, he lifted the bucket before she asked. When the storms frightened her at night, he kept the lantern burning outside her door until morning. She tried to resist, tried to remind herself she was only sold, not saved. But his quiet care unsettled her. It was not love, not yet, but it was something stronger than pity. It was respect, the kind she had never known before. Still, the house felt like a cage to her. The fields stretched endlessly, and freedom seemed so close, yet unreachable. She wondered if her unborn child would grow up in chains of sorrow or find a reason to smile. She did not see a future, only shadows. The rancher, too, carried his own silence. He never asked for her trust, never demanded her loyalty. But deep inside, he hoped the walls between them might one day fall. He had waited years for someone to share his world, yet now that she was here, he realized the battle was not to win her presence, but to heal her broken spirit. And though she could not see it, he knew the story they had just begun was moving toward a moment that would change both their lives forever. Days turned into nights, and nights into weeks. Yet the silence between them did not fade. It slowly began to change. At first, she thought his kindness was nothing but duty. But then she started to notice details that could not be ignored. The broken window in her room was suddenly fixed. The sharp nails on the old door had been hammered down so her dress would not tear, and the blanket that covered her was always warm from the fire he had prepared before she slept. He never spoke of these things, never asked for thanks, and never looked for recognition. But she noticed. In those small acts she saw something she had not felt for a long time: care without conditions. One evening, when the townsfolk gathered near the marketplace, whispers began about her shame, about the girl sold by her own blood. She heard the cruel laughter, the judgment in every glance, and she felt her heart sinking once again. But before their voices could wound her deeper, he stepped forward, silent yet strong, shielding her from their scorn. He did not fight with words. He simply stood close enough to remind them she was no longer alone. For the first time, she felt a strange safety beside him, as if the world's cruelty could not reach her anymore. That night, as she returned to the ranch, her thoughts were heavy, but her eyes searched for him differently. Fear still lived inside her, but trust was quietly growing. Like a seed breaking through stone, she realized he had never raised his voice, never touched her without permission, never treated her as less than human. Instead, his actions spoke louder than any promise, and slowly, her heart, scarred by betrayal, began to soften. Their days remained quiet, yet the silence was no longer sharp. It was gentle, almost comforting. He worked in the fields while she prepared small meals, not because he demanded it, but because she wanted to give back in some way. They shared glances instead of words, and in those glances was a connection neither of them could explain. At night, when the wind howled against the windows, she no longer cried in secret. Instead, she listened to his steady footsteps in the hallway, and the sound was enough to keep her calm. He, too, felt the change. Her eyes no longer carried only fear. Sometimes they carried a spark of trust. It was fragile, delicate, but real. For years, he had known only silence, and now that same silence carried meaning. A bond that did not need to be spoken. Two souls, once broken and lost, were slowly finding each other in the quiet spaces between words. What began as a cruel deal was transforming into something no one expected: a bond built not on force, but on trust, respect, and the silent hope that maybe, just maybe, life was giving them a second chance. The bond between them was still fragile, but fate did not wait for it to grow slowly. It was a cold night when the sky turned black and a storm rose over the wide fields. Thunder shook the earth, and rain hammered against the roof like angry fists. She felt the first wave of pain deep in her body, sharp and unbearable, and she knew the time had come. Fear gripped her heart as another contraction tore through her, and she cried out his name without thinking. In an instant, he was by her side, his face pale but steady. He had never been more frightened in his life, yet he held her trembling hands as if his strength could keep her alive. Lightning split the sky, and the wind screamed, but inside that small room only her broken cries filled the air. He tried to stay calm, whispering that she was not alone, that he would never leave her. But her pain only grew stronger when he saw the danger in her eyes. He knew she needed help beyond his strength. Without hesitation, he wrapped his coat around her, lifted her into his arms, and stepped into the raging storm. The mud pulled at his boots, the rain blinded his sight, and every step felt like a battle against death itself. Yet he kept moving, holding her close as if she was the only reason. His heart still beat. The town was miles away, and the storm showed no mercy, but he pushed forward, praying that the night would not take her or the child she carried. Her screams pierced through the wind, but he kept whispering back, begging her to stay strong, promising that she would see the morning. At last, he reached the small cabin of the old midwife who lived on the edge of town. She lit a lamp quickly, guiding him inside as he laid the young woman on a worn bed. His hands shook, his heart raced, and he felt helpless as her pain reached its peak. Hours felt like years, and every moment he feared losing both of them. He stayed beside her, holding her hands so tightly it seemed their souls were bound together. She looked into his eyes, no longer seeing a stranger, but the only person she could trust with her life. And then, when the storm was at its fiercest, the moment came. A sharp cry filled the air, breaking the silence of fear. The baby's first breath was like a miracle sent from the heavens. Tears filled his eyes as he watched her cradle the child, her pain replaced with relief and fragile joy. The storm outside still raged, but inside the small cabin a new world had begun. He realized then that everything he had waited for, everything he thought he had lost, was now in front of him: her trust, her strength, and the tiny heartbeat that gave them both a reason to live again. When the storm finally broke, and the night gave way to dawn, the rancher looked at the fragile life sleeping in her arms and felt a warmth he had never known. The emptiness that once haunted his days was gone, replaced by a purpose that filled every corner of his soul. She, once betrayed and discarded, now saw herself not as a burden, but as a woman valued, safe and cherished. Their hands touched lightly, no words spoken, yet everything was understood. The baby's soft breath was the sound of healing, the proof that broken hearts could be mended. What began as a cruel bargain had transformed into the gift of a family, born not from wealth or power but from pain, courage, and hope. And as the sun rose over the quiet ranch, they realized their darkest nights had given them the miracle they had both been waiting for.